One of Marvel's more popular characters is Wolverine. A lot of this has to do with his bad boy, renegade like personality, and of course, the action that accompanies him in most of his stories. Because of this, Wolverine has some baggage where a lot of people view his stories as just mindless violence for the sake of violence and action, but he does have plenty of stories that are much more deeper than that. Many of his more insightful storylines involve themes such as struggle and humanity, and of course, overcoming that and being a human. Weapon X is one of the most standout examples of this. Weapon X by Barry Windsor Smith is a story that gets brought up a lot in discussion, but more as a bullet point in Wolverine's history as opposed to the actual content of the story. It was published in 1991 in issues 72 through 84 of the anthology book Marvel Comics Presents. Presents was a book that would bring attention to lesser known characters and would tell 8-page stories in each issue. Similar to how Marvel Team Up was essentially a Spider-Man title, Marvel Comics Presents at certain points was essentially Wolverine's book, with him becoming the most recurring character throughout the original run. But back to the story at hand, Weapon X has more in common with a sci-fi horror comic than what a lot of your average superhero books would have at the time and what you would expect from a title like Marvel Comics Presents. A solid comparison I can think of for that would be Alien's Labyrinth, which came out a few years prior to this, about 4 years prior. Both books sharing similar themes and having pretty similar art styles as well. Weapon X is told mostly from the perspective of the individuals conducting the experiments on Wolverine. The main three that we follow are Carol Hines, Cornelius, and a man who is only known as the Professor. Through most of their eyes, Logan loses his humanity once he becomes one of their experiments, and reclaiming that humanity ultimately becomes the main theme of the story for Logan. From the Professor's perspective, Logan is more just another test subject that he's having to work on for this mysterious company. A monster that he created or a wild animal that he captured that's being forced into being trained to do whatever his bidding is. Throughout the story, the Professor doesn't even refer to Logan as a human, and even tries to correct those who do refer to Logan by his actual name or just by calling him a man. There are points throughout the story where the perspective does change to that of Logan's, but it is pretty subtle and usually shown through visual cues. Which brings me to Windsor Smith's art. Starting things off, Barry Windsor Smith's art is great and up to his usual standards for comic illustrations, in my opinion. Earlier on in the story, when Logan is being experimented on, Windsor Smith likes to use layouts in various L or U shapes when it comes to panels and dialogue placement. Doing so, Windsor Smith really takes advantage of the medium that he's in, which forces you to read the story in a very specific way. If you don't read it in that specific way, there's a chance you could feel as lost as Logan potentially does in those moments. What makes it great is you can read it in varying different ways. If you read it just standard left to right, you can get a rough idea of what's going on, but if you read it in the intended arc-like shape, you will get the complete story. So you can either read it from the perspective that the people experimenting on Logan have, or if you prefer to read just left to right and try and tank through it that way, you can kind of recreate that disorienting feel that Logan would have inside the tank that he's trapped in. A lot of the setup for these characters is also done through visuals, mostly hidden behind text boxes. Through this, we learn a little bit about Carol. We get to see a lot of Cornelius' background, and of course, we get to see what Logan was up to prior to being abducted. With Carol, we see her signing her forms to get the job at this facility, and you can kind of see some of her background details on her file. There are newspaper clips referring to Cornelius as a mercy killer quack and how he's being sued for malpractice. For Logan, we get to see some of his military documents, showing what he was up to in the army and why he's being dismissed. Some qualities highlighted for his dismissal include his violent and self-destructive tendencies. A lot of the things on Logan's file imply that if he were to go missing, nobody would really go out of their way to go looking for him. Other visual cues that are shown throughout the story to let us know when we are in Logan's POV or when we know that Logan is in control of the situation is the sound of his claws coming out. Throughout the book, there isn't much reference to X-Men related things or any real fan servicey thing outside of the snick sound effect. For most of the story, the sound is much more violent whenever the claws come out. After the adamantium gets put in, the accompanying sound is usually pretty aggressive. The onomatopoeia sound effect that accompanies it is more of a shk or shuck type of sound. implying that it's really forced and potentially even very painful for Logan. Whenever it's used, it's mostly when he's coming out of a drug-induced coma-like state and he's going berserk, or the other instance where you see that is when he's being completely manipulated by the professor through the experiments. The moments where we do see Logan in control only happen a very select amount of times and could easily be looked over if you aren't paying close attention to the onomatopoeia. There are a couple of moments where the snick does show up, implying that Wolverine and/or Logan is completely in control of his actions at this moment. There is a slight twist near the end of the book. The book doesn't end exactly where you think it's going to, but I'm going to leave that up to you for when you hopefully read this book. But I will just say that the end of the story is best summed up with the quote, "Some guys, they got the worst destinies, you know." So in the end, I think Weapon X by Barry Windsor Smith is very worth checking out, and a lot more interesting than a lot of people give it credit on the surface for. I'm pretty sure it's still in print at the moment. If it isn't, it shouldn't be that expensive of a book to pick up online. I highly recommend you check it out if you're a big Wolverine fan and you haven't read this for whatever reason, or if you want to get more into Wolverine and you'd like a good jumping on point, I'd highly recommend this or the Claremont miniseries, which I may make a video about in the future, but we'll see when we get there. With that being said, thank you for listening or watching, however you consumed this video, and I will catch you guys next time.